The laughter hit me like a slap across the face. Loud. Sharp. Cruel. It rippled through the room, echoing off the chandeliers of the country club ballroom. I stood there in my pale blue dress, clutching the small purse I had borrowed from my neighbor because I wanted to look just a little fancier for my daughter's wedding. "That's the fat pig we have to put up with," Jason's cousin announced, his voice slicing the room like a knife. My cheeks burned hot, and I felt every set of eyes land on me. They weren't kind eyes. They were eyes filled with disgust, pity, mockery. The champagne glasses trembled in their hands as they chuckled, whispering into each other's ears. I heard one woman mutter, "How embarrassing for Marissa, having a mother like that." My own daughter. My Marissa. And yet, she didn't say a word in my defense. She just looked away, adjusting her veil as if the humiliation wasn't unfolding right in front of her. I tried to swallow, but my throat was so tight it hurt. For 63 years, I had held my head high through storms, through nights when bills were stacked on the kitchen table higher than the bread box, through mornings when my late husband Daniel had worked double shifts and still come home with grease on his hands. I had never allowed myself to crumble, not in front of my children, not in front of anyone. But standing there, in that glittering hall, surrounded by people who laughed at me like I was the punchline to some cruel joke, I felt something inside me crack. Jason's mother gave me a once-over from head to toe, her lips curled in a way that made me feel smaller than I had ever felt before. "You'd think she'd try a little harder," she said loudly, not even bothering to whisper. I gripped my purse tighter, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But my legs refused to move, like my body had rooted itself into the floor. Jason, my brand new son-in-law, didn't help. He smirked, sliding his hand into my daughter's like they were partners in crime. "Mom, Dad," he announced proudly, "this is Eleanor. She's, well, you can see what she is. But she's Marissa's mother, so we're stuck with her." The guests erupted again, some chuckling, others snickering behind their napkins, as though humiliating me was part of the entertainment. My ears rang with the sound of it, like firecrackers exploding too close. My chest tightened. I wanted to shout at him, to remind him that I had raised the woman he was lucky enough to marry, that without me there would be no wedding, no Marissa, no love story for him to boast about. But all that came out was silence. My lips pressed together in a thin, trembling line as I willed myself not to cry. People always say that the worst pain comes not from strangers, but from the people you love. And it's true. I could forgive the cousins I'd never met, the aunts who wrinkled their noses, the men who laughed behind their whiskey glasses. But what hollowed me out, what ripped the air from my lungs, was the sight of my daughter lowering her eyes, pretending not to see, not to hear. Marissa had once clung to my skirts as a child, begging me to stay a little longer at bedtime. She had once said, "Mom, you're my best friend." But now, on the most important day of her life, she let me stand there alone, stripped bare before strangers. Betrayed not by her silence, but by her choice to belong to them instead of me. "Look at her face," another guest muttered. "She's about to cry." That word, cry, set off another round of laughter, cruel and sharp, until I thought my heart might burst. But I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I forced myself to breathe. In. Out. My body shook, but I stood tall. My mother had once told me, when people want to tear you down, you don't bend. You straighten. I straightened now, though every bone in me felt brittle, though every beat of my heart screamed that I wasn't strong enough. I straightened because I refused to let them break me. Not here. Not today. Jason's aunt leaned over her champagne glass, whispering loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. If I were her, I'd be too ashamed to even show my face. The laughter followed again, and I felt the walls closing in. I thought of Daniel, my husband, gone these 12 years. He had been the kind of man who would have stepped forward, wrapped an arm around me, and silenced them all with one glare. But he wasn't here. And without him, I felt naked. Vulnerable. My hands trembled, but I clasped them in front of me like a shield. I whispered a prayer under my breath, begging God for just a sliver of dignity in that moment. "Eleanor," Jason's mother said, loud enough that heads turned, "why don't you take a seat in the back? Maybe you'll be more comfortable there." Her voice dripped with mock politeness, but the sneer on her lips betrayed her. The back. Like I was an embarrassment to be hidden away, like I didn't belong among them. I wanted to shout, "This is my daughter's wedding. I belong more than any of you." But my voice stuck in my chest. I managed only a faint, "I'm fine right here," though the words felt like ashes on my tongue. The woman sniffed, clearly pleased with herself. The crowd smirked and shifted, returning to their drinks, their gossip, their cruel enjoyment. What they didn't see, what no one in that room could know, was the storm brewing inside me. I had lived 63 years not as a victim, but as a fighter. They saw a tired widow in a second-hand dress, a woman with too much weight and too little shine. But what they didn't see were the nights I stayed up working on ledgers for a company that now stretched across 3 states. What they didn't see were the contracts signed with my name, the real estate deeds tucked away in a safe deposit box. What they didn't see was the empire Daniel and I had built, brick by brick, while raising children and pretending we had nothing. They didn't know that I had walked into that ballroom with more power than half the men sneering at me combined. They didn't know, but they were about to. The laughter died suddenly, like someone had cut the strings on a puppet show. Jason's father had stepped forward, his glass halfway to his lips. His eyes landed on me, narrowed, then widened. He blinked once, twice, and the color drained from his face. "Wait," he said, his voice breaking the hum of chatter. "Aren't you my new boss?" The room went silent, so quiet I could hear the clink of ice in a forgotten glass. All the sneers vanished, every cruel grin evaporating into stunned confusion. Dozens of eyes swung back to me, searching for confirmation, for explanation. I stood still, my heart pounding, my hands gripping my purse like it was the only solid thing in the room. Jason's father, Henry Townsend, CEO of the company Jason bragged about endlessly, stared at me like he had just seen a ghost. And in that silence, I felt the shift. The weight of power sliding back into my hands. What they didn't know, what Marissa didn't know, what Jason didn't know, what not a single one of those people suspected, was that everything they thought they had over me was a lie. I was not the weak, pitiful woman they mocked. I was the woman they had underestimated. And they had no idea the price they were about to pay for that mistake. When Henry Townsend's words echoed in the wedding hall, my mind spun backward through the years like an old film reel. Standing in that ballroom, I could almost hear the crackle of our first tiny house's heater, smell the grease on Daniel's shirt when he came home after his night shifts, and feel the cold linoleum under my feet as I balanced our checkbook by hand at the kitchen table. People saw me now, heavy gray hair pinned back, calloused hands, and they thought they knew my story. But they didn't. They hadn't lived through the hunger, the late notices on bills, the days when a box of macaroni and cheese was stretched into 2 dinners because the children needed to eat before we did. They hadn't seen me walk into a pawn shop with my mother's wedding ring so I could buy Marissa her textbooks. Every wrinkle on my face had been earned, carved by years of sacrifice. I met Daniel when I was 19, fresh out of high school. He wasn't rich or polished, but he had the kind of hands that promised work and the kind of eyes that made me believe I'd never be alone. We built everything from scratch. He started as a mechanic, I worked as a waitress, and together we raised 2 children while dreaming of more. I can still remember the smell of oil clinging to his clothes when he stumbled in at midnight, so tired he'd fall asleep in the chair. But every paycheck, no matter how small, we saved a sliver. Pennies, then dollars, until one day we had enough to put down on a rundown duplex in a neighborhood most people avoided. Everyone laughed at us for buying it. But Daniel patched the roof with his own hands, and I scrubbed those floors until they shone. When we rented it out, we realized, for the first time, what possibility looked like. That was the start of it. One duplex turned into another, then another. We sacrificed vacations, new clothes, dinners out. When our friends bought new cars, we drove a rusted Chevy until the floorboards gave way. While the world laughed, we kept building. By the time I was 40, Daniel and I owned 6 properties. By 50, we had investments in a small chain of auto shops. People thought we were just scraping by, and we let them think that. We wore thrift store clothes, we clipped coupons, we kept our business private. Daniel used to say, "The strongest tree grows in silence, Ellie. Don't let anyone see our roots until they're strong enough to weather a storm." I believed him. But it wasn't just money. It was time. It was me missing nights of sleep so I could do payroll after helping Marissa with her science fair project. It was staying behind when Daniel traveled to hammer out contracts so I could take care of the kids. It was watching birthdays slip by while we poured everything into building a future we could hand down to them. My son Robert always said he felt cheated, that we were too busy working to notice him. He never understood that the very reason we worked so hard was for him and his sister. For them to never feel the fear we felt opening an empty fridge. For them to walk into a store and know they could buy something without counting coins first. Daniel passed 12 years ago. Heart attack. He collapsed in the garage on a Tuesday morning, and I remember the way my hands shook when I dialed 911. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Just like that, my partner, my other half, was taken from me. The day of the funeral, I looked at our children and promised him, out loud in front of the casket, that I would keep everything we built alive. That I would make sure our sacrifices weren't wasted. That they would have the life we dreamed of. And I kept that promise. I never remarried. People told me I should, that I was still young, that I could find happiness again. But I had married once for love, and that was enough for me. I poured myself into my family and into our business. Every decision I made was for them. When Robert wanted to study architecture, I paid his tuition in full, never letting him know the money came from the rental income. When Marissa wanted ballet lessons, I worked an extra shift, never letting her see me stumble into bed at midnight. They thought I was just scraping by, but I wanted it that way. I wanted them to live free of the burden I carried. The secret was heavy, though. Over the years, our business grew beyond anything I'd ever imagined. The auto shops expanded, the real estate tripled, and eventually, a small logistics company we invested in merged with Townsend Enterprises, Henry's company. My late husband used to say, "Stay humble, Ellie. Don't let the world know what you have. Real power doesn't need to scream." And so, I stayed in our modest house. I wore my old clothes. I went to church on Sundays with the same people who thought I was barely surviving. They didn't know that in the bank sat enough money to change their lives. They didn't know that my signature on a single piece of paper could sway entire businesses. But now, standing in that ballroom, I saw how my humility had given others the license to look down on me. I had made myself invisible to protect my children, but in doing so, I had taught them to see me as small. And that cut deeper than any insult Jason's family could throw. It was one thing for strangers to sneer, another for my own daughter to shrink from me like I was a stain on her perfect day. Had I hidden too much? Had my silence built a wall between us instead of a bridge? The truth was, I never wanted to embarrass my children with wealth. I wanted them to grow up grounded, knowing the value of work. I thought hiding my success would protect them from entitlement. But maybe, just maybe, it had bred something worse, disrespect. Marissa had looked at me in that ballroom like I was something she needed to cover up. My heart ached at the thought. All those nights I stayed up worrying over fevers, all those sacrifices I made so she could shine. Did she ever really see me? Or had she only ever seen what I allowed her to see, a tired, struggling widow? I thought about Daniel's last words to me. He had gripped my hand in the hospital weeks before the heart attack that finally took him. His voice was rough, but clear. "Ellie," he said, "don't forget your worth. The world will try to make you small. Don't let them. Even for the kids." I had nodded then, tears in my eyes, promising him I'd remember. But I hadn't. I had let myself fade. And now, surrounded by people who mocked me openly, I realized I had betrayed his words. As the silence stretched in that ballroom, with Henry staring at me in horror and recognition, I felt Daniel's voice echoing inside me again. For years I had lived quietly, letting people believe I was nothing. But maybe it was time. Maybe it was time they saw who I really was. Not for vanity. Not for revenge. But for dignity. For Daniel. For myself. I straightened my shoulders, lifting my chin. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had stripped me bare. But what they didn't know was that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every tear I shed in silence had built a foundation they could never tear down. And standing there, I realized something else. She had no idea that her years of sacrifice were about to be tested in ways she never imagined. The silence in the ballroom that night didn't last. Once Henry muttered those words, "Aren't you my new boss?" Whispers started buzzing like flies. Some people looked at me with confusion, others with skepticism, but Jason was quick to laugh, brushing it all off. "Dad, you must be mistaken," he said, clapping him on the back. "That's just Marissa's mom. She barely gets by on a pension. Don't go confusing her with someone important." He spoke with such confidence, such casual cruelty, that the guests seemed to relax again, their snickers picking back up. Marissa gave me a weak smile across the room, the kind a person gives when they want to pretend nothing happened. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to end here. The laughter, the disrespect, it wasn't a one-time humiliation. It was the beginning of a pattern I had been too blind, too patient, too forgiving to admit was already happening. The days after the wedding only confirmed it. Jason insisted that I didn't need to bother myself with staying for the gift-opening brunch the next morning. "It's for family," he said pointedly, as though I wasn't Marissa's family. Marissa didn't argue. Instead, she pulled me aside in the hotel lobby and said, "Mom, maybe you should head home. You've had a long trip." She kissed my cheek but wouldn't meet my eyes. I drove back alone, tears blurring the highway signs, clutching the wheel so tightly my fingers cramped. When I pulled into my quiet driveway, the weight of it hit me. They didn't want me there. Not for the brunch. Not for the photos. Not for the new life they were beginning. My sacrifices had built a foundation for them, but now I was being pushed to the edges, erased from the picture. Weeks passed, and the phone calls dwindled. Marissa used to call every Sunday, just to tell me about her week. Now, she only called if she needed something. "Mom, do you still have that old sewing machine? I need it for the curtains." "Mom, can you watch the dog while we go on a trip?" There was never a "how are you?" or "do you want to come with us?" Each time, I told myself it was just the adjustment of newlywed life. But deep down, I knew better. Jason's voice was always there in the background, dismissive, mocking, sometimes whispering but loud enough for me to hear, "Don't make her feel too comfortable. She'll never leave." It wasn't just Marissa. My son, Robert, had grown distant too. He lived 3 states away, and when he called, it was more obligation than warmth. "Hey Mom, just checking in," he'd say, his voice distracted. I'd tell him about the garden or the church potluck, and he'd respond with silence or a quick "That's nice, Mom." I offered to visit once, and he sighed. "It's not really a good time. We're busy." Busy. Always busy. My children, the ones I had given everything for, suddenly didn't have room for me in their lives. One night, Marissa invited me to dinner at her new house. I thought maybe it was a chance to reconnect. I baked her favorite pie, apple with cinnamon sugar crust, just like she loved when she was little. But when I arrived, Jason looked at the pie and laughed. "Oh, she brought food. That's quaint." He didn't even put it on the table. Instead, he served some overpriced takeout and joked about how old-fashioned I was. Marissa giggled, though I saw her glance at me, guilt flickering for just a second before she looked away. The pie sat untouched on the counter all night. When I left, I carried it back to my car, holding the warm dish against my chest like a wounded animal. I ate a slice alone at my kitchen table, tears sliding down my cheeks, the sweetness turning bitter in my mouth. Another time, Jason threw a backyard barbecue and invited the entire neighborhood. He told me to sit over there, pointing to a folding chair in the corner away from the main group. When I tried to join a conversation, he interrupted with a joke at my expense. "Careful what you say around Eleanor. She still thinks a smartphone is too advanced for her." The guests laughed politely, and I felt my face heat. Marissa didn't step in. She just served another plate of ribs, pretending not to hear. I sat in that corner, listening to them talk about vacations, new cars, promotions, all the things I had sacrificed so they could live that way. And not one person asked me a single question. Not one. The more it happened, the more invisible I became. At church, people asked after Marissa and Robert, but no one asked about me. At the grocery store, I saw other mothers shopping with their daughters, laughing together, choosing flowers or trying on scarves. I remembered when Marissa used to beg me to buy matching bracelets. Now she didn't even want to be seen with me in public. It wasn't just neglect. It was shame. Shame of me. Shame of the woman who had carried her, fed her, clothed her, prayed for her. Still, I tried. I tried to give them everything I could. I wrote checks when bills piled up for Marissa and Jason's new house. I offered to help with the mortgage when Jason hinted they were a little tight. I babysat their dog, watered their plants, brought groceries when I visited. And every time Jason would say, "Thanks, but we'll take it from here," as if to remind me that my help was both expected and unwanted. I gave anyway, because giving was all I knew. But each gift felt like a stone in my pocket, dragging me down. Then came the breaking point. Marissa called me one afternoon, her voice tense. "Mom, Jason doesn't think it's a good idea for you to visit anymore. At least not so often." My heart stopped. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. She hesitated, then whispered, "He says it's embarrassing. The way you dress. The way you don't fit in with his friends." Silence stretched between us. I wanted to scream, to demand she defend me, to remind her of the nights I stayed awake sewing her dresses for school dances because we couldn't afford store-bought ones. But I couldn't. The words stuck like glass in my throat. Instead, I said, "I understand, even though I didn't. Even though I never would." That night, I sat alone in my living room, the television flickering in the background. I stared at the family photos on the mantel, Daniel holding the kids at the beach, me braiding Marissa's hair, Robert building Lego towers on the carpet. I thought of all the years I had poured into them, all the sacrifices I had made, and wondered, had I done it all wrong? Had I raised them to believe love was something to be taken, not returned? My chest ached with the weight of it. I whispered into the empty room, "Daniel, I don't know what to do." But as the tears dried on my cheeks, something hardened inside me. I had let them walk all over me because I believed love meant sacrifice. But love didn't mean erasing myself. Love didn't mean becoming invisible. I looked at those photos again, and I realized something I had never admitted out loud. My children might not respect me, but that didn't mean I wasn't worthy of respect. Jason might mock me, Marissa might shrink from me, Robert might ignore me, but I was Eleanor. I had built an empire from nothing. I had carried this family on my back. And I was done being their doormat. I whispered it to myself, my voice steady now. It's time they remembered who they're dealing with. The morning after I whispered that vow to myself, I woke with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The humiliation, the neglect, the whispered insults, they had carved something new inside me. I realized that all these years, I had been waiting for my children to see my worth. But worth isn't something you wait to be given. It's something you claim. And if Jason and his family thought they could erase me from my own daughter's life, they were about to learn otherwise. The Eleanor they mocked at the wedding wasn't the Eleanor I truly was. For 63 years I had lived with quiet sacrifice, but I was also a woman who knew how to build, how to calculate, how to plan. I had not survived poverty, widowhood, and decades of hard work just to be reduced to a joke. I started small. I took out the box Daniel and I had kept in the back of the closet. Old files, copies of contracts, tax returns, and most importantly, a list of names. Business partners, investors, friends who owed us favors. I flipped through them like a general reviewing her soldiers before battle. These weren't just numbers and names, they were connections, people who trusted me, people who had once told me, "Eleanor, if you ever need anything, call." For years, I never did. But now it was time. The first call I made was to Daniel's old attorney, Gerald Mason. He was retired now, living in Florida, but when he picked up the phone, his voice lit up with recognition. "Ellie? My God, it's been ages. How are you holding up?" I hesitated, then told him everything. The wedding, the humiliation, Jason's sneers. Gerald listened quietly. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Ellie, if you want me to look into the boy, I can. You'd be surprised what's public record." My heart raced. For years, I had respected Jason as Marissa's choice. But if he was dragging her into danger, financial, legal, or otherwise, I had a responsibility to know. Do it, I said simply. Find out who he really is. While I waited for Gerald's results, I began watching more closely. Jason liked to talk. At dinners, he bragged about his business acumen, his investments, his plans for expansion. But I noticed the cracks. He spoke of deals that never seemed to close, of partners who were always conveniently unavailable. I asked Marissa once, gently, "Do you and Jason have a budget?" She rolled her eyes. "Mom, you don't understand. Jason's taking care of it. He knows what he's doing." The blind faith in her voice made my stomach twist. I had seen that tone before, in wives who didn't know their husbands were gambling away paychecks, in women who thought their men were building castles while actually digging holes. A week later, Gerald called back. His voice was heavy. "Ellie, I don't know how to tell you this, but your son-in-law is drowning. Credit cards maxed out. Personal loans unpaid. He's been using Marissa's name to open accounts. And the worst part? He's got ties to people you don't want to be indebted to." My blood ran cold. Jason, the man who mocked me for bringing a homemade pie, was building his shiny new life on a mountain of lies and debt. And he was dragging my daughter straight into the collapse. I didn't tell Marissa. Not yet. She was still under his spell, still blinded by the glow of new love. If I came to her with accusations, she'd push me further away. No, I had to be patient. Strategic. Daniel always said, "Ellie, you don't show your cards until the other man thinks he's already won." So I smiled when I saw them. I nodded politely when Jason called me quaint. All the while, I was gathering threads. I reached out to an old tenant who had gone on to work in banking. He owed me a favor. I once let him slide on rent when his daughter was sick. Over coffee, I asked him casually if he'd ever heard of Jason Townsend. His eyes flickered. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Guy applied for a business loan last year. Got denied. Twice. He's got a reputation for overextending himself. Some folks say he's just a con with a nice smile." He leaned in closer. "Ellie, if your daughter's tied up with him financially, she's in danger." I thanked him, my heart pounding. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. It wasn't just money. I began noticing how Jason spoke to Marissa in private. At a family dinner, I saw him squeeze her wrist under the table when she tried to disagree with him. She laughed it off, but I caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. Another time, I overheard him on the phone, his voice low and sharp. "If you don't get me that money, I'll make sure you regret it." He slammed the phone down when he noticed me in the doorway, then plastered on a smile. "Just business, Eleanor," he said smoothly. But I knew better. I wasn't alone in this. My neighbor, Ruth, a widow like me, had always been sharper than most gave her credit for. When I told her bits and pieces, without revealing too much, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Honey, you've got two choices. You can keep letting them treat you like furniture, or you can remind them you built the house." Her words stuck with me. I wasn't just uncovering Jason's lies for Marissa's sake. I was doing it for myself. For every time they shoved me into the shadows. The more I dug, the more I discovered. Jason had been boasting to his friends that he'd inherit money once Marissa was in control of my estate. He had no idea that the estate he dreamed of was already locked tight, structured to pass only through my terms. He thought I was weak, powerless, easy prey. But I was the one holding the strings. And soon, he'd learn what it meant to underestimate a woman who had weathered storms he couldn't imagine. By the end of that month, I had a thick folder of evidence. Debt records, failed loan applications, whispers of shady deals. I laid them out on my dining table, the same table where Marissa had once done her homework, where Robert had built Lego castles. Looking at the papers, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. This was my daughter's husband, the man she had chosen. But if I didn't act, she'd be destroyed along with him. That night, I opened Daniel's old journal. He had written once, "Ellie, remember, knowledge is power. But timing is everything." I ran my hand over the words, tears pricking my eyes. Timing. That was the key. I couldn't rush this. I had to wait for the right moment, when the truth would land like a hammer and leave no room for denial. I closed the folder, slid it into my bag, and looked at my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the broken mother mocked at her daughter's wedding. She wasn't the invisible widow eating pie alone at her kitchen table. She was Eleanor, builder, survivor, fighter. And she was ready. Armed with this information, I was ready to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. For weeks, I carried the folder like a secret weapon. It never left my side, tucked carefully into my handbag, the weight of it both terrifying and empowering. Every page in that folder was a blade, sharp and precise, ready to cut through Jason's glossy facade. But Daniel's words echoed in my mind: timing is everything. If I showed my hand too soon, Marissa would dismiss me as bitter, jealous, incapable of understanding her husband's brilliance. No. Jason needed to build his own stage, invite his own audience, and then I would pull the curtain. The first step was simple: let Jason believe I was exactly what he thought I was. Quiet. Harmless. The kind of woman who sat at the edge of the room and smiled politely while the men spoke. At dinners, I asked him about his businesses, nodding with wide-eyed interest as he spun tales of expansion and foreign investors. Inside, I ticked each lie off a growing list. Fascinating, I'd say softly, and his chest would puff with arrogance. He thought he was dazzling me, when in truth I was taking note of every inconsistency, every fabrication, every inflated promise. I also began dropping small, intentional remarks in Marissa's ear. Not accusations. Never that. Just questions, wrapped in concern. Honey, Jason works so hard. Does he ever sleep? You don't want him getting burned out. Or, you two are planning a trip next month? That's wonderful. I just hope it's not too much of a strain with all the business things he's juggling. She would laugh, brushing me off, but I could see the hesitation flicker in her eyes. Seeds, that's all they were. Seeds that, in time, would grow. The next step was riskier. I needed Jason to expose himself, not just to me, but to the very people he was desperate to impress. So, I began to host small gatherings at my home. Nothing fancy, just dinner parties with neighbors, a few of Daniel's old business contacts, acquaintances who had long respected our family name. When I invited Marissa and Jason, I made sure the guest list included people who could see through Jason's act. Bankers. Lawyers. Men and women who had built their wealth through discipline, not deceit. At the first dinner, Jason strutted like a peacock. He bragged about a pending deal with an overseas investor, about a partnership with a tech company I knew for certain had denied him twice. I watched as Gerald Mason, who had flown in to join us, sipped his wine slowly, eyes narrowing. Jason mistook Gerald's silence for admiration. He had no idea he was performing for a jury. And I, seated at the head of the table, smiled sweetly, occasionally prompting him with questions that gave him more rope to hang himself. But Jason wasn't the only one I needed to convince. Marissa was still blind, still clinging to the image of her charming husband. So I orchestrated moments, carefully planned cracks in the facade. I asked Jason once, in front of her, how his new business account was going. He stuttered for a moment, then recovered with a too-slick answer. I caught Marissa's puzzled glance. Another seed planted. Another thread loosened. I also noticed something else: Jason's temper. For all his arrogance, he was brittle. One evening, when a guest at my dinner gently questioned his knowledge of the market, Jason snapped, a flash of anger so sharp that the room fell silent. He recovered quickly, laughing it off, but not before Marissa's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. That was what I needed. Not just lies exposed, but character revealed. People forgive a liar if he is charming enough. But arrogance and cruelty? Those leave stains. Still, I knew none of this would matter without undeniable proof. And so, I worked quietly with Gerald. We arranged to obtain copies of Jason's unpaid debts, his failed applications, even an affidavit from a former partner who accused him of misappropriating funds. It wasn't easy. The partner was reluctant, afraid of retaliation, but Gerald knew how to negotiate. When I finally held the signed statement in my hands, my fingers trembled. This was it. The sword that would cut through the veil. But swords must be wielded carefully. I couldn't simply hand Marissa a stack of documents and expect her to believe. Jason had wrapped himself around her heart, convincing her that they were a team against the world. If I attacked him head-on, she'd see me as the enemy. So, I did what any strategist would do. I set the stage for Jason to reveal his true self, while my evidence waited as the final strike. I began to notice Jason growing bolder. My gatherings had given him a taste of prestige, and he craved more. He started suggesting we pool family resources for investment opportunities. One evening, in front of Marissa, he smiled at me and said, "Eleanor, you're sitting on assets that could really blossom with the right guidance. I could triple your holdings in 6 months." His tone was smooth, but his eyes were hungry. Marissa looked at me hopefully, as though waiting for me to say yes. I tilted my head and gave him a gentle smile. "Jason, dear, I'm just an old woman who doesn't understand all these modern investments. But you seem so capable. Why don't you prepare a proposal for me? Something formal, something I can really study." His grin widened. He thought he had me. He thought the bait was taken. Inside, my heart pounded with anticipation. The trap was closing. Over the next few weeks, Jason sent me documents, hastily written proposals filled with inflated numbers, empty promises, and outright fabrications. I filed each one neatly into my folder, proof not only of his incompetence but of his audacity. Each document was another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. The final piece fell into place on a Friday evening. Jason invited Marissa and me to dinner with his family at a country club. It was their territory, their arena, where I was meant to feel small. But I walked in with my head high, the folder resting quietly in my bag. Jason's father Henry was there, stern, sharp-eyed, a man who had spent his life building empires. Halfway through the evening, Jason launched into another of his grand speeches about a new investment venture. Henry's jaw tightened as he listened. And then, almost casually, he turned to me. "Eleanor," he said, "you've been quiet. What do you think of Jason's plans?" The table fell silent. Jason looked at me expectantly, confident I would either fumble or flatter. I smiled, my heart steady. "Well," I said softly, "I think Jason has quite the imagination. The question is whether imagination can pay debts." The words slipped into the air like a knife. Jason's face blanched. Henry's eyes snapped to him, sharp and calculating. Marissa froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. That was the moment. The first fracture in the facade. The trap was nearly ready to spring. But not yet. "Timing," Daniel's voice whispered. "Timing is everything." So I sipped my wine, smiled politely, and let the silence linger like a shadow across the table. Jason laughed nervously, changing the subject. But the doubt had been planted, not just in Marissa's heart, but in Henry's. As we left the club, Jason's hand gripped Marissa's arm too tightly, his smile stretched thin. He glanced at me, his eyes filled with something new. Not arrogance. Not mockery. Fear. And that was when I knew, the trap was set. The next morning, I stood at my kitchen window, the folder open on the counter beside me. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, but inside me was only storm. The time for silence was over. Jason had mocked me, humiliated me, stolen my daughter's trust, and tried to dig his greedy hands into everything I had worked for. Enough was enough. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. There comes a moment when quiet strength must speak. Today was that moment. It wasn't easy deciding how the confrontation would happen. I didn't want a private scene where Jason could twist my words or paint me as bitter. No. This needed an audience. The same way he had humiliated me at Marissa's wedding, he would now be unmasked in front of the very people whose approval he craved most. So, I accepted his invitation to a family brunch at Henry's estate that Sunday. He thought it would be a chance to secure more of my trust. He had no idea it was going to be the battlefield. The estate was sprawling, with manicured lawns and tall white columns that seemed designed to make guests feel small. As Marissa and I walked up the steps, her arm linked with mine, I felt her tension. She was trying so hard to keep the peace, her smile brittle. "Mom, please," she whispered, "don't make today difficult. Jason really wants you to see he's serious." I squeezed her hand gently. "Sweetheart, I said softly, "I've seen enough." She frowned, but before she could question me, the doors opened. Inside, the long dining table was already filled. Jason sat at the head, grinning like a king. His parents, Henry and Linda, were beside him, along with a scattering of business associates and extended family. I recognized a few of them: bankers, investors, people of influence. Perfect. Jason wanted to parade me as his gullible mother-in-law with resources to offer. Instead, I was about to turn his stage into his trial. Jason rose to greet us, kissing Marissa's cheek before turning to me. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, "so glad you came. You'll find today enlightening." His eyes glittered with the smugness of a man who believed the game was already won. I gave him a polite smile, then took my seat at the opposite end of the table. The meal began with idle chatter, but Jason couldn't contain himself for long. Within minutes, he launched into his pitch, a grand speech about expansion opportunities, global investments, and guaranteed returns. His voice carried through the room, smooth and confident, weaving lies with the ease of a practiced charlatan. Marissa watched him proudly, her eyes shining with misplaced faith. I felt a pang in my chest. She had no idea she was loving a ghost. When Jason finally turned his attention to me, the room quieted. "Eleanor," he said, smiling like a predator who thinks the prey is cornered, "I've prepared something special for you. A chance to be part of something truly extraordinary. With just a fraction of your assets, I can." I raised a hand, cutting him off. My voice was calm, steady, but it carried across the table like a bell. "Jason," I said, "before you continue, perhaps you should explain why your last 3 ventures ended in bankruptcy. Or why your former partner filed a sworn statement accusing you of fraud." The air froze. Forks clattered against plates. Marissa's smile faltered, confusion spreading across her face. Jason blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. I reached into my bag and laid the folder gently on the table. The sound of it landing was louder than any shout. "This," I said, "is what I'm talking about." One by one, I pulled out the documents, the unpaid debts, the failed applications, the affidavit. Each page slid across the polished wood like a stone skipping across water. Gasps echoed around the room. Jason's face drained of color. "These are lies," he shouted, his composure unraveling. "Fabrications. She's making this up because she resents me." Henry leaned forward, his eyes like steel. He picked up one of the documents, scanning it quickly. His jaw tightened. "This is your signature," he said coldly, tapping the page. "You told me this deal was still active." Jason sputtered. I can explain." "Explain." I cut in, my voice sharp now. "Explain how you nearly bankrupted your last partner? Explain why you've been circling my daughter like a vulture, waiting to bleed her dry? Or perhaps you'd like to explain why you thought I was just a foolish old woman too blind to see through you." The room was silent except for Jason's ragged breathing. Marissa sat frozen, her face pale, tears brimming in her eyes. "Jason," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is it true?" Jason's mask cracked completely then. He turned to her, desperate, his tone shifting to syrupy pleading. "Marissa, darling, don't listen to her. She's trying to poison you against me. She's jealous, she doesn't understand." "Jealous?" I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. The years of silence, of swallowing pain, burst free. I gave everything for this family. I worked, I sacrificed, I buried my husband and carried the weight of our lives on my shoulders while you strutted around chasing schemes. Do not dare call me jealous, Jason. You are a fraud. And today, everyone sees you for what you are. His charm evaporated. Rage twisted his features as he slammed his fist on the table. You think you can ruin me? You're nothing but an old woman living off her dead husband's money. Gasps rippled around the table. Marissa flinched as though struck. Henry's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Enough, Henry thundered, rising to his feet. Do you realize what you've done? The embarrassment you've brought to this family. He turned to me, his voice quieter but firm. Eleanor, forgive me. I had no idea. He told us. His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Jason had lied to them all. For the first time in years, I felt tall. My spine straightened, my heart steady. You don't need to apologize, Henry, I said softly. I didn't come here for revenge. I came here for the truth. And now it's out. Jason collapsed back into his chair, his bravado gone, his hands trembling. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but found only cold, condemning eyes. Even Linda, his mother, refused to meet his gaze. Marissa sat rigid, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. I reached across the table, touching her hand gently. Sweetheart, I whispered, this is the man you've trusted. The man you've defended against your own blood. You deserve better than this. Better than lies. Better than betrayal. Marissa's hand shook under mine, but she didn't pull away. She turned slowly toward Jason, her voice breaking. You promised me, Jason. You promised we were building something real. Jason reached for her, but she recoiled as though his touch burned. Don't, she whispered, her eyes filled with heartbreak and fury. Don't touch me. The room was heavy with silence. Jason's downfall was complete, and he knew it. His empire of lies had crumbled in a single morning. But for me, it wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. Years of silence, of being dismissed and belittled, had finally given way to truth. And yet, as I sat there, my hand wrapped around Marissa's, I knew this was only the beginning. Jason's lies had been exposed, but the damage they had caused was still raw, still bleeding. Healing would take time. Justice would take more. I closed the folder gently, sliding it back into my bag. This is done, I said softly. But I promise you, Jason, this is only the beginning. You wanted to play games with me. You had no idea who you were dealing with. And in that moment, watching Jason shrink under the weight of his own ruin, I knew, the reckoning was just around the corner. The morning after the confrontation, I awoke with a strange sense of quiet inside me. Not peace, not yet, but a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The truth was out, and Jason's mask had been torn away. But exposing a fraud was only the first step. Lies leave scars, and those scars don't fade overnight. There was still a reckoning to come, for Jason, for Marissa, for the entire family who had allowed his arrogance to flourish while dismissing me as a relic of the past. By mid-morning, the calls began. Linda, Jason's mother, phoned first. Her voice was trembling, layered with shame. Eleanor. I don't know what to say. We trusted him. We trusted our son. Please understand, we didn't know. I listened quietly, my heart torn between pity and anger. Linda, I said gently, this isn't about me. This is about Marissa, and the life Jason has tried to steal from her. You should think less about what you didn't know and more about what you'll do now that you do. She cried softly, then promised me she would speak with Henry. I ended the call without offering comfort. I had no more to give. Henry himself called an hour later, his voice crisp and unyielding. Eleanor, he said, you were right. I should have seen through him. A man who lies in business will lie in every part of his life. There was no apology in his tone, only resolution. I will not let him use our name to dig himself deeper. His accounts will be frozen by the end of the week. His so-called ventures will die here. For the first time, I heard something almost like respect in his voice. You handled him with dignity. More than I would have. I allowed myself a small smile. Henry, dignity is all I've ever had. And sometimes it's enough. But the hardest conversation came that afternoon, when Marissa finally came home. She looked like a ghost, pale, her eyes hollow from crying. She stood in the doorway of my living room, trembling as though she didn't know if she was welcome. My heart broke at the sight of her. Come in, sweetheart, I said softly. She hesitated, then rushed into my arms, collapsing against me with a sob. Mom, she cried, her voice muffled against my shoulder. How could I have been so blind? You tried to warn me, and I pushed you away. I defended him. I laughed with him while he insulted you. And you still stood by me. I stroked her hair gently, holding her as I had when she was a child. Marissa, love doesn't make us blind. It makes us hopeful. You wanted to believe in him. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. She pulled back, tears streaking her face. But I hurt you. I let him humiliate you. At your own granddaughter's wedding, I let him laugh at you in front of everyone. A pain twisted inside me, but I pushed it aside. Yes, you did. And it broke my heart. But Marissa, you are still my daughter. And I would rather endure humiliation 1,000 times than see you tied to a man who doesn't deserve you. Her sobs deepened, but I held her until the storm passed. That evening, Henry arranged a family meeting at his estate. Reluctantly, I agreed to attend. This wasn't about me. It was about ensuring Jason could never weasel his way back into Marissa's life. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Jason sat slouched in a chair, his face pale and drawn, the arrogance gone. For once, he looked small. Henry stood at the head of the room, his voice cold as iron. Jason, he said, you have embarrassed this family. You lied to us, to your wife, to her mother. You've brought nothing but shame. Jason opened his mouth to protest, but Henry silenced him with a raised hand. From this day forward, you are cut off. No funds. No support. If you want to prove yourself, you will do it on your own, without dragging us into your lies. Jason turned to Marissa, desperation in his eyes. Marissa, please, he begged, don't let them do this to us. We can rebuild. We can. Marissa's voice shook, but it was firm. There is no us, Jason. You destroyed that the moment you chose lies over love. I can't follow you into your ruin. Her words were quiet, but they struck harder than any shout. Jason crumpled, his head in his hands. I watched in silence, my heart torn between satisfaction and sorrow. I had wanted this moment, had dreamed of it through nights of humiliation and despair. But watching a man unravel, even one as cruel as Jason, didn't bring me joy. It only brought me clarity. Power was never about revenge. It was about truth, about dignity, about finally being seen. Then something unexpected happened. Gerald, the banker who had helped me gather Jason's records, spoke up. Eleanor, he said, addressing me in front of everyone, you carried this burden alone for too long. You exposed him with patience and intelligence. You've reminded us all that wisdom isn't loud, it's steady. He raised his glass. To Eleanor. The quiet strength none of us appreciated until now. One by one, others followed. Even Henry inclined his head toward me in acknowledgement. I felt a warmth spread through me, not pride, but something deeper, validation. For years I had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as though my worth ended with my youth. But here I was, finally recognized not for wealth, not for status, but for strength. Jason, meanwhile, was led from the room by his own mother, who wept quietly. His empire of lies had collapsed. And though I felt no triumph, I felt no pity either. Some lessons must be paid for in full. Later that night, as I sat alone in my home, Marissa came to me again. She knelt by my chair, taking my hands in hers. Mom, she whispered, I don't know how to move forward. But I know this, I will never doubt you again. You've always been my rock, and I was too blind to see it. From now on, I'll listen. I'll stand with you. Tears blurred my vision as I cupped her face. Marissa, I said softly, you don't need to stand with me. You just need to stand on your own. And when you stumble, I'll be here. Always. As the night settled into silence, I realized something important. This reckoning wasn't just Jason's downfall. It was the family's awakening, a long overdue reminder of who I was, and what I had given. They had forgotten my sacrifices. They had dismissed my wisdom. But now they knew. And as I closed my eyes, I thought, the reckoning was done. But the new beginning was just ahead. The morning sun poured through my curtains like liquid gold, warming my face as I sat at the edge of my bed. For the first time in years, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. Jason was gone, his lies finally stripped bare. The battles had been fought, the tears shed. And though the scars would remain, I could feel something shifting inside me, a quiet renewal, like the first green shoots after a long, cruel winter. Downstairs, the house smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread. Marissa was already in the kitchen, her hair tied back, her face still pale but softer now, calmer. She looked up as I entered, and for the first time in months, she smiled. A real smile, not the brittle mask she had worn under Jason's shadow. "Good morning, Mom," she said. Her voice was gentle, almost childlike. "I made breakfast. Sit down." I sat, watching her move around the kitchen with a grace I hadn't seen in so long. It struck me that she looked younger somehow, as though shedding Jason's influence had lifted years off her spirit. She set a plate in front of me, then sat across the table, her eyes filled with emotion. "I was thinking," she began cautiously, "maybe we should start over. You and me. Like when Dad was alive, those Sunday mornings when it was just us, laughing over burnt pancakes." Her voice cracked, and tears shimmered in her eyes. I reached across the table and took her hand. "Marissa, we can't go back to what was. But we can build something new. Stronger. Wiser. Together." Her fingers squeezed mine, and in that moment, I knew she understood. Later that week, Henry invited me and Marissa to a dinner at his estate. At first, I hesitated. After all, the humiliation I'd endured at that wedding had unfolded under his roof. But something in his tone told me this wasn't about appearances. So we went, dressed not in gowns or jewelry, but simply as ourselves. The dining hall was smaller than the one from the wedding, more intimate, the lights dimmed to a warm glow. Henry stood as we entered, his posture stiff but his eyes softer. He raised his glass as we sat. "Eleanor, Marissa," he began, "I owe you both an apology. I let my son's arrogance blind me. I dismissed your wisdom, Eleanor, and I allowed Jason's lies to infect this family. For that, I am sorry." The room fell silent. For a man like Henry, whose pride was as thick as armor, these words were not small. I inclined my head, acknowledging the gesture. "Henry," I said, "apologies don't erase wounds. But they can stop the bleeding. Let's make sure the future is better than the past." He nodded, relief flickering across his stern face. Dinner was quieter than I expected. No gossip, no sharp remarks, no dismissive laughter. Instead, there was reflection, even gratitude. Gerald, the banker, raised a toast to truth, however painful. Linda, Jason's mother, wept quietly, confessing that she had ignored signs for years, convincing herself her son was flawless. And then Marissa spoke, her voice steady and strong. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "But I do know this: I won't let myself be silenced again. My mother taught me that strength isn't loud. It's steady. It's standing when the world tries to bend you. I want to be that kind of woman." Her words struck me deeper than any toast. For all the pain, all the humiliation, this was the gift I had prayed for, my daughter rediscovering her strength. As weeks passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Jason disappeared into the shadows, cut off from his family's wealth, his name whispered only as a cautionary tale. Marissa found work at a local nonprofit, pouring her energy into helping women escape toxic relationships. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her purpose. And me? I found myself invited into spaces I had once been excluded from: family discussions, community meetings, even Henry's board dinners. Not because I demanded a place, but because they finally saw the value I carried. One afternoon, Henry approached me privately. "Eleanor," he said, "our family has been rudderless for too long. You have something we don't: perspective, patience, a backbone that doesn't bend. I'd like you to advise us, formally. Help us keep our feet on the ground." The request startled me. For decades, I had been the invisible woman, the widow with little more than quiet endurance. And now, here was a man of power asking for my counsel. I smiled faintly. "Henry, I'm not interested in titles or influence. But if I can help keep your family from repeating old mistakes, I will." And so it began, a slow, steady reclamation of the role I had been denied. Not as a matriarch by bloodline, but as one by spirit. One evening, as Marissa and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me with a thoughtful look. "Mom," she said softly, "do you ever wish things had turned out differently? That Jason had been the man we thought he was. I thought about it, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I shook my head. No. Because if he had, we might never have learned the truth about ourselves. You would still be silenced. I would still be invisible. And this strength we found? It might never have come to light. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and together we watched the sky fade into twilight. Months later, Marissa remarried, not with grandeur, not with glittering chandeliers or 100-guest feasts, but in a small garden surrounded by people who truly loved her. She wore no diamonds, only a simple dress, and as she walked down the aisle, her smile was radiant. I stood by her side, not as a figure to be tolerated, but as the mother who had walked through fire to protect her. As the vows were exchanged, I felt tears slide down my cheeks. Not of sorrow, but of profound joy. My daughter was free. My family had awakened. And I was finally seen. In the quiet that followed, as laughter drifted under the stars, I realized something important. Power isn't in wealth. It isn't in youth or beauty. It isn't in who speaks the loudest. True power is in endurance, in standing tall when others try to bend you, in speaking truth when lies surround you, in loving even when the world humiliates you. I had been dismissed, underestimated, ridiculed. But I had never broken. And now, at last, they all knew. As I lifted my glass to the night sky, I whispered to myself, this is the new beginning. And it's mine. My love. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.